This episode of the Impact Podcast is brought to you by Closed Loop Partners. Closed Loop Partners is a leading circular economy investor in the United States with an extensive network of Fortune 500 corporate investors, family offices, institutional investors, industry experts, and impact partners. Closed Loop's platform spans the arc of capital from venture capital to private equity, bridging gaps and fostering synergies to scale the circular economy. To find Closed Loop Partners, please go to www.closedlooppartners.com. Welcome to another edition of the Impact Podcast. I'm so honored to have with us today our first edition ever in 1,500 shows from Australia. Leif Cox is with us. He's the founder of the Orangutan Project. Welcome to the Impact Podcast, Leif.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's an honor to have you on, Leif. And the work that you're doing is just so important. But before we get talking about the Orangutan Project itself, tell us a little bit of your background, your biography, where you grew up, and how you got even interested in this, in these wonderful animals.
I grew up in Hong Kong, so one of the largest, most dense metropolises that you could imagine.
Yeah.
But even then, when I was a very young child, I had a love of animals and wildlife. And so I started working with 15 orangutans and discovered that not only they're beautiful animals, but they're also persons, self-aware beings, just like we are. And they don't belong in captivity. No person does. But I also discovered that they are being slaughtered in the most horrific way that we can imagine and driven to extinction. So that started my lifelong mission to save orangutans on the vision that one day all orangutans will live free in the wild in secure habitat in viable populations.
So you grew up in Hong Kong. I've been there many times. Now, I grew up in New York City, and I liken Hong Kong and New York very similar. Lots of tall buildings, lots of concrete. I got my love from animals because I grew up with racehorses, and I became a professional trainer of horses and things of that such. Where did your love of animals and orangutans come from? Was it going to as a child, where did your mom and dad have a love for animals, or did they take you to zoos, or how did that even start?
No, I mean, certainly love of any subject could be nurtured, but I think for me it was fairly innate. Although we lived in this, flat in this large, apartment complex, 25 story buildings, 15 in a row, concrete and car parks. My bedroom was like a little menagerie, budgeriguards and tropical fish and aquariums and terrapins and so. Oh my God. I virtually created my own little jungle, I guess, in my own room. And I think it was just an innate love of life and animals.
And was your family originally from Australia before they settled in Hong Kong? So that's how you ended up back in Australia?
Yeah, exactly. Because my father was a art director for advertising agencies. So he moved to Southeast Asia when I was 18 months old. And so that's where I was brought up. But we eventually came back to Australia, where I did my university education and started formally studying and researching orangutans and their conservation.
So your classic education, in terms of your Masters of Science and things of that such, were basically in this field. You knew you were going there, and you studied this at university before you actually started in 1998 the Orangutan Project.
It was kind of often a parallel process. So I was working with the orangutans, and I wanted to learn more about them to help them. So my postgraduate diploma in primate behavior, my Masters of Science studying orangutans were there to help me discover and learn and get information to help orangutans. At the same time, parallel to that again, was I started the work and the Orangutan Project to help save them in the wild.
For our listeners and viewers, we've got Leif Cox with us. He's the founder of the Orangutan Project. Please, to find Leif and the great work that he's doing with orangutans and to support this important organization, please go to www.theorangutanproject.org. I'm on that site right now. I have it up in front of me. It's a gorgeous site. It's very informative. Plus, also, there's ways to get involved and donate and things of that such and learn much more about Leif. Leif, talk a little bit about the problem. Let's first, before we talk about the solutions that you're working on, thank God you're doing this great work. What's the problem? Why as in 2021, why are we slaughtering these gorgeous animals? None of this makes sense to me.
Mm-hmm. It's about greed, and greed from a very few people. So a few people are destroying the rainforest for the value of the trees and replacing the rainforest with unsustainable forms of monoculture such as palm oil or pulp paper. And so what they're doing is they're taking away the economic, environmental future from Indonesia. They're taking away the land and the environmental services from local communities, destroying biodiversity, killing the orangutans, and contributing to climate change in one of the most significant ways. And so they're basically destroying the planet as such and passing the true cost of production onto the powerless, orangutans, local communities, biodiversity, and future generations. So it's just an exploitative model where they basically extract wealth at the expense of others.
Wow. And so, comparatively speaking, I'm 58 years old. So when you and I were young boys growing up, how big was the orangutan population and how have we destroyed it in these last 3 or 4 decades? How much is it? How much are we destroying it? And how desperate is this need for you to have this very important organization?
Well, the first 20 or 30 years of our life, it was pretty much okay. There was vast tracts of wilderness left. In the last 20 years, these big multinationals have come in and destroyed 80% of the rainforest, 80% of orangutan habitat, and the populations have plummeted to the point now that they're all on the verge of all populations tipping over to become unsustainable and collapsing, including the rainforest collapsing, because you need a certain amount of rainforest to support rainforest.
Right.
And so you have these tipping points where we're at the verge now in this decade of whether things that you basically, the orangutan population and the rainforest itself will virtually collapse, or we can rebuild now to save the planet and the orangutans.
In 1998, you decided to found this world-renowned organization, now world-renowned organization, the Orangutan Project. What was your mission when you launched this? I know we're 23 or 24 years later now, but first when you launched it, what was your mission and what was your focus then?
Mm-hmm. I mean, the mission is that one day all orangutans will live in the wild in secure populations in viable habitat. And that basically recognizes, well, 2 things. Is one, as a critically endangered species, that they deserve to survive, and their survival is intrinsically linked to our survival, because we have to save and rewild the planet in order for our species to survive. The second thing is to recognize that these are self-aware persons, the most intelligent being that shares our planet. We can have a conversation with them, and they don't deserve to be killed and slaughtered as simply an agricultural pest.
Are they being slaughtered during this process, or is it a de facto slaughtering, as you say, in the liquidation and the wholesale destruction of the rainforest, or is it a combination thereof of both?
Mm-hmm. The classic scenario is they destroy the rainforest, and obviously then orangutans will either die in the process or they're starving, because now there's not enough food to support the remaining orangutans, which have fled the destruction of their areas. And then they basically become agricultural pests. They try to eat the young palm oil that's planted there, or they raid local villages' crops. And so it's basically they become vulnerable and then end up, being slaughtered.
And it's also important to note that orangutans should not also be in zoos. We should not be supporting the captivity of these beautiful animals for our own viewing pleasure in a zoo setting.
Yeah, there's two aspects to that. Is although zoos can do some really wonderful stuff, for example, reintroducing numbats or the California condor, and so very targeted programs for small species can actually work out quite well, and they can do a great deal of benefit. But what zoos can't do is save megafauna. They can't save elephants, tigers, orangutans, gorillas. Their populations are unsustainable by their very nature. So zoos can't save their own collections, neither can save them in the wild. So there's no conservation value for keeping orangutans in captivity. The second thing is, and that's regardless of the wonderful care that many orangutans have been given by dedicated, loving zookeepers. But the analogy I give is at refugee camps. Refugee camps are run by the most wonderful people who care for people and who want to help them. But what we know, the long-term internment of people in these camps causes long-term psychological damage because they're persons. They have to control who and when they contact with us. They have anxieties about the future, worries about the past. They need control over their environment. And therefore, as persons, equally, orangutans don't do well in captivity. They're mentally damaged by the process, no matter how loving and caring the keepers are for them. And this is why they can only really successfully live a meaningful life in happiness if they can live that in their own environment, in their own societies.
What's the general age range if an orangutan lives in its natural habitat in a rainforest setting that's not been destroyed yet? How long do they typically live?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a very good question. In the wild, we don't not quite sure because we've only been studying for 40 or so years, and we think they must live at least since the early 60s for the slowest reproducing species in the world, the orangutan, to survive. And so, early 60s, if not a little bit more, it would be the classic lifespan for wild orangutan. Unfortunately, in captivity, when I did the research on captive survival, even when taking out the very high infant mortality, most orangutans would on average die in about 12 to 15 years. A few could survive longer, but you can see the long-term chronic stress of captivity basically undermines the immune system and makes them vulnerable to diseases and health issues, including diabetes, which is widespread in the captive community, which simply doesn't exist in the wild population.
So you started the Orangutan Project. For our viewers and listeners who just tuned in, we've got Leif Cox. He's the founder of the Orangutan Project. You could find Leif, support his important organization at www.theorangutanproject.org. What exactly are you doing, and what can we do to help you and also support other great organizations like yours in around the United States and wherever our listeners? We have listeners all around the world, obviously. How can we support you in your efforts, and how can we turn the tide on this absolutely tragic information you're sharing with us today, that these animals are endangered? It's only at our own hands that this happened.
Mm-hmm. The first thing is to, I guess, highlight the time span we have to work with. Now, we're hearing from COP26 is that, look, we've got 10 years to turn this around. After that, there's feedback loops, which means that the ecosystem on the planet may be unrecoverable. And so we've got 10 years to turn this around. And it's no surprise we also have 10 years to turn this around for the orangutans. And the reason is these things are intrinsically linked. Destruction of rainforest, it causes about 28% of climate change. And then the feedback loop where increasing droughts, etc., are basically destroying the rainforest. So rainforest is affected by climate change, and so most of these populations are being slowly dwindled. And orangutans are basically a lowland species, and the palm oil and the pulp paper and the coal mines tend to want the lowlands as well. And so we really only got next 10 years to save viable ecosystems of the right type, shape and size of rainforest to take the orangutans, elephants, tigers, and indigenous human communities through this crisis. After that, the rainforest will not be sustainable. The populations of orangutans will not be sustainable. So our vision is that one day, within the next 10 years, we can secure 8 ecosystems of the right type, shape, and size of rainforest to secure these populations and provide the biological basis to start rewilding the planet to make it once again sustainable for human life as well as all the other biodiversity. Then the second part of the question is what we can do about it. Now, we've kind of been sold this lie for the last 10 or so years that our individual actions can make a difference. Our individual actions have never made a difference. Humans are extremely successful and the most successful species on the planet, not because we're particularly smart as individuals or capable as individuals, is that we have the capacity to collectivize. Smart people collectivize their capital in businesses to make a lot of money. Smart people collectivize their political interests in parties to make a significant difference. Individuals can't. That doesn't mean as individuals we don't have a moral responsibility to live a life without hurting and affecting others in a negative way. However, if we really want to achieve something, we've got to put aside this lie of us saving the planet through our personal choices. We've got to collectivize. And this particular situation is one of the most cost-effective ways we can mitigate climate change and the most significant thing we can do to the most vulnerable persons on the planet, the orangutans. It's to collectivize an organization such as the Orangutan Project, and we work together to achieve the vision. So what can people in America or around the world do is there's 2 things that people can do. They can provide funds. We all vicariously buy positions in developing nations. Standard of living is subsidized from the exploitation of others in other countries. And we can give back at least some of that to solve the problem. And that's a basic moral obligation of the privileged position that we're in. And so, please become a contributor to the Orangutan Project or another organization that can effectively help achieve your vision for a better future. The second part is we can hold our leaders accountable. Now, the truth, one thing I mentioned, we've got 10 years to turn this around, but 90% of the human population has no ability to affect meaningful change. They don't have the money to give. Secondly, they have no political power. They live in totalitarian dictatorships. They're poor, struggling to feed their families. It's only us in countries such as America, UK, and Australia as examples that we have wealth, but also we have the possibility of political influence. We can affect our leaders' decisions. And therefore, the moral obligation of us being the most important generation in all human history. This is a 10 years that's going to determine the future of humanity. So those tens of thousands of years that occurred before, they're no more important time than now. And we are the small subset of humans that have the capacity to make that meaningful change the planet. So we have this great obligation and privilege to act now decisively through collectivization and to make meaningful change before it's too late.
You've been doing this work. This is a lifetime of work, but the Orangutan Project, Leif, has been a child of yours, a baby of yours for almost 24 years now. How has it evolved in terms of your view? Has the progress you've made been, and the response you've gotten from, as you said, political leaders and others of influence, been appropriate or helpful so far? Or have you been discouraged and just fought on in the wake of lack of action by even intelligent leaders that are out there?
Yeah, there's a couple of elements to that. One is actions through government have been wholly ineffectual. The reason being is we've lost control of most of our democracies to to self-interest of large business and multinationals. So we know that, and it's the same in America. There's several papers published that America no longer is an effective democracy because the decision of government doesn't reflect the will of the people, it reflects the wills of their funders. So there is this kind of inability, I guess, for governments all around the world to actually effect meaningful change. So it's been extremely ineffectual. On the other hand is, look, I work with so many wonderful Indonesians who are dedicating their lives, put their lives on the line, often have their lives lost to save their future for their countries, to save the land of indigenous communities, save the economic future and the biodiversity of Indonesia. And so what I do believe is effective in the time frame. Yes, we have to reform our political systems to make them, more democratic, and more inclusive of benefiting everybody in the community. But in order to meet the time frame, what we're doing is working with wonderful local organizations and people and indigenous communities and working together to save the ecosystems. And the wonderful thing is that we're discovering through developing agricultural systems on the rainforest canopy, such as shade coffee, shade cocoa, honey production, is that we can work with the local communities that they can become prosperous and economically, affluent through keeping the rainforest intact and therefore making the agricultural system sustainable. So it's a huge win-win solution. So I hope to, when I leave this planet, to leave the ecosystems not only environmentally, but economically sustainable to pass on to future generations. Now, we have to take these communities through this transition because it takes 5 to 7 years to set these agricultural systems. And so you may be surprised that, we actually feed school children, we educate them, we provide scholarships, and we support women's rights and women work groups as some examples. Because it's not wildlife versus people or the environment versus economy. These are win-win solutions. And we're taking the indigenous communities through this and developing their success into the future. And so that's kind of, I guess, 2 examples, I guess, of what we're trying to achieve.
Leif, approximately now, is it known how many orangutans are left on this planet right now?
The honest answer is we don't, because we don't have the time resources to survey and hard to find. So they're estimates based on nest counts, which there's huge variability in it. But what we do know is they're all critically endangered, which is the highest category of concern before extinction. And so they're all on the brink. And so we really only got the next few years to turn this around. And we also know that because orangutans adapt to the environment through culture predominantly, not natural selection, same as humans, we pass on culture from generation to generation, which makes us far more adaptive to the ever-changing environment. Orangutans do this by having very long maternal periods. They suckle their infants for 8 years, and and they stay with the mother, up to 12 years, learning the culture. They're born with vacant brains, which is programmed by the mothers. And the system works really great for adaptation and because they reproduce very slowly, invest in very few offspring. But unfortunately, that makes them very vulnerable to extinction when a super predator such as humans come along because they can't bounce back easily. We also started the International Elephant and International Tiger projects to bring those species under our umbrella of protection because they're falling out of our protective umbrella that we set up for orangutans in these ecosystems. But let's say for tigers, what we've discovered is that if you protect them, they bounce back fairly quickly. Because they breed relatively quickly, they adapt to the environment for natural selection rather than culture. But orangutans don't do that very well. And in fact, if you only kill 1% of the females in a sustainable population a year, the population spirals to extinction.
I mean, what you just said is fascinating in that, so you're saying females might go through their whole life and only have one child, one offspring.
Usually maybe about 3. So let's say Sumatran, there's 3 species of orangutan. So it's we got to be careful not to generalize. But let's take the Sumatran orangutan.
Okay.
They had the first baby at 15, and then there's 9 years between individual infants, and they'll keep breeding, and obviously until they get very old. And so very slow levels of reproduction. But, on the other hand, they're the most caring, loving mothers. So infant mortality is very low. In fact, actually, maternal mortality of the female orangutans in the wild is the same as female mortality of humans giving birth in America.
Oh my gosh!
So they do look after each other, and without an external predator, they do have a very high rate of survival and do quite well.
Going back to something you said earlier about the absolute tragic nature of the slaughter of these beautiful animals, they share about 97% or so of our DNA. So they're the closest. These great apes are the closest to us out of any of the species that are out there.
They're not our closest relative. The closest relative actually is the chimpanzee, which is 99% of.
Wow.
But in some ways, that actually makes orangutans actually much more cooler because humans and chimpanzees share this trait of aggressiveness and warlike behavior. Chimpanzees and humans will look at another person and want to destroy them. We will destroy others. We will have warfare against other tribes. So that's the nature of our aggressive ancestors. Orangutans don't have that. They're a far more noble form of persons. And I'll give an example of this as, we killed over 1 million orangutans, slowly, slaughtering them to extinction in the most horrific ways that we can manage it, macheting them, burning them alive.
Oh.
And although orangutans are 7 times stronger than a human, and the males have canines the same size as tigers, in not one time in recorded history, in not any zoo or wild or sanctuary, that an orangutan has ever killed a human being. They're not capable of that, what I call a kill switch, and wanting to totally destroy another being, and as we do. And so that's the added tragedy. We have more noble humanity and persons. We share a planet that we should be emulating in so many ways.
Right.
And these peaceful, loving creatures, and we're destroying them as we speak.
And the intelligence level you said of these beautiful animals is very high in terms of being able to process information and communicate with humans as well.
Exactly. As I said, the most intelligent being that shares our planet. And as persons, they have anxieties about the past and worries about the future. So what a person does is project themselves in the past and the future. They're just not living in the now.
Right.
And therefore, their capacity to suffer is much greater than animals of less intelligence. So humans, we suffer a lot. Most of our suffering is in our minds, and it's about past and future. Very little of our suffering is actually in the now. And orangutans are the same. And so, I've had to care and console orangutans which have been bombed in World War II, because when there's fireworks, they believe they're being bombed again, and you have to console and try to rebuild the minds of orangutans which have their mothers slaughtered and eaten in front of them. Their little minds are damaged.
They're capable of having PTSD like humans.
Yeah, exactly. And we're just discovering how fantastic they are. Researchers, for example, are discovering not only they use obviously thousands of plants to feed off, they use plants for medicines, topical treatment to treat malaria. And when they go, we'll wonder what they're using, what's the different medicines for. Surprise, surprise, they go to the indigenous communities who are using the same plants for the same issues that they're uncovering. So you've got these 2 persons showing a forest, basically also finding the same solutions of medicines and passing those culture down from generation to generation. This is one of the reasons that it's so important to save these populations. We're not only saving genetic diversity, the genetic framework to survival, we have to save the culture as well, because culture is how they adapt to the environment so they can pass on future generations. And one of the interesting things is when we talk about orangutans being persons, male orangutans have this big cheek pads and a throat sac. They call out to attract females and keep other males away, and it's like a big megaphone. And in the evening, when they nest in the trees, they will say, future me, I'm going to go up and move this direction in the morning. So they then point their big cheek pads and basically call into the direction that they're going to go the next morning. So they've already planned the next day. And so they're always thinking ahead into the future. In fact, they'd have this huge cerebral cortex, which is basically this computer simulation. And this is why, let's say, in zoo situations, you probably see chimpanzees trialing an area, trying to do something, let's say escape, trialing an area, running around, doing it. Orangutan would just sit there and just run the program in the head over and over until they get the right solution, then just walk out, escape.
So they save a lot of energy because they refer to their brain to really help them work through things.
Exactly. It's a huge survival mechanism, because when you're a large body, large brain animal such as an orangutan, you've got to conserve energy in the rainforest. And so they don't act. They don't act. They act once and then decisively, and have thought about it for a long time before they make any actual action in itself.
So really, some of what you're sharing today, besides supporting great organizations like yours, it's also to support politicians and other leadership that really are truly going to make strides towards turning this environmental crisis that we're living through around, because part and parcel with turning the environmental crisis and the wholesale liquidation of our environment around the world will be also helping save the orangutans around the world as well.
Yes, exactly. And we got the two forces, and it actually goes down to brain biology. You have the conservative force, and if you have a conservative mindset or brain, new information gives you fear.
Right.
And that's a good reaction, because making changes is dangerous. Things can go better, but they've also got terribly good. But the conservative mind will look at things like climate change or a better way of doing things and react with fear, and then cognitive dissonance to turn it away.
Right.
I think in American terms, a liberal mind reacts to new information by excitement. Oh, this is interesting. These are opportunities. Climate change. We need to change this, that sort of stuff. And so you have those two kind of forces, within our mind, reacting to new situation with fear and denial, and not because they're unintelligent. That's just the way the brain's set up, or reacting to it. There needs to be some balance, because, let's say take the Arab Spring. We can make these rapid changes, but then they end up really badly. What I mean. So we have to. There is that kind of balance there. But my predominant message is we do need predominantly politicians with a progressive outlook, because we have to make rapid change. We have to make those daring changes the next 10 years. So although conservatism can actually be, a benefit to many times in the world, we need very progressive and quickly moving policies in order to save this planet now. So I would encourage people to go for those visionaries, the visionary
Right.
politicians who are willing to make the hard decisions and change the status quo. Because I guess now is not the time for our more conservative nature to dictate our outcomes, because we will go under.
Leif, I want to let you have the last word on any thoughts you want to share with our listeners and our viewers and our readers around the world. This is a very critical mission and project that you've created, and I'm, of course, grateful for your time today. But therefore, I want to give you the last word, and then I'll sign off for us together.
I guess my last message is, actually doing good and helping others is a pathway of joy and happiness. So there is no sacrifice in a meaningful, selfless life. If we if we live that life, we find the happiness within us and express that through intelligent ways in the world. Actually, it's a win-win situation. All these things are win-win situations. So there is no sacrifice here. Working for our own power, name, fame, reputation, and money, inevitably, you can see it yourself, leads to misery and unhappiness. But if we work for others in a sense of community and direction, we become happier, and we express the happiness. So there's no downside of living a meaningful life that helps others, because it helps us as individuals too.
Leif, you're living a very meaningful life. We're so grateful for your time. I know it's very early in Australia right now, and we're very grateful and thankful for the impact that you're making at the Orangutan Project. For our listeners and viewers and readers out there that want to support Leif, that want to find or connect with Leif and his very important mission at the Orangutan Project, please go to www.theorangutanproject.org. Theorangutanproject.org. You could donate money, you could support, you could connect with Leif and his colleagues and help save these beautiful animals. Leif, thank you for making the world a better place. Thank you for the impact that you're making. Thank you for being selfless and really, really just doing this really important work. I'm just grateful for you. God bless you. Continued good health. And I just want you to continue to succeed in this great mission.
Thank you. Thank you.
This edition of the Impact Podcast is brought to you by the Marketing Masters. The Marketing Masters is a boutique marketing agency offering website development and digital marketing services to small and medium businesses across America. For more information on how they can help you grow your business online, please visit themarketingmasters.com.